Demjanjuk, as some of you no doubt know, he was, I think, we could all probably agree that he was a very minor figure who operated at the very bottom of the SS exterminatory hierarchy, and yet he nevertheless became the subject of the lengthiest and arguably the most bizarre and convoluted criminal case to arise out of the Holocaust. Um, and all told, Demjanjuk was tried four separate times. He was tried twice in the United States on civil immigration charges, basically for, in a sense, kind of lying on immigration forms and on his visa. He was tried once in Israel um, as this Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka, and that has to go down in the annals of legal history as one of the most notorious cases in identity. And then he was tried once again in Germany, this time on charges completely unrelated to the mistaken Treblinka charges that were brought against him in Jerusalem. Now he was tried not as Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka, but what we might describe as kind of Ivan the Not So Hot of Sobibor. Sobibor was another SS death camp, and he was convicted in Munich in 2011, and then he actually died about 10 months later while his case was still being appealed. So in deciding to write about this long legal odyssey of Demjanjuk, because I suppose I was trying to do a number of things in The Right Wrong Man. I guess first I was trying to tell what I thought was a really quite gripping and bizarre history in a followable, granular, exciting fashion. So that was one thing that I was trying to do. I suppose another thing that I was trying to do was because that he was tried in these multiple different countries, his case provided a particularly nice conduit for looking at how these three separate domestic legal systems, the American, the Israeli, and the German, all struggled to deal with the problem of the collaborator in Nazi genocide. I suppose another thing that I was trying to do in this was to show the way in which, in this effort to try to deal with the problem of the collaborator, that what jurists ultimately had to do is they had to basically work out an unprecedented collaboration with historians. So there was a very interesting collaboration between professional historians on the one hand, lawyers and jurists on the other. And it was only through this unusual collaboration that we're able to find, in my mind, a kind of a successful model for dealing with the problem of the collaborator. On the other hand, I suppose another thing that I was trying to do was to show the way in which the Cold War and the way that Cold War tensions provided a very complex background in which all these different actors were operating. That is, I think you can't really make sense of this very complex, bizarre case, Demjanjuk, without understanding the Cold War and then the dissolution of the Cold War, because again, it was the matrix in which all these various operators, various persons were operating, and it very much shaped the complexion of all the different cases that were brought against in these four separate trials that I've already just mentioned. And then finally, I suppose what I was trying to do in the book was really to look very closely at what was distinctive about his trial in Germany. Because in many ways, his trial that started in 2009, ended in 2011, it represented a pretty dramatic break with the case law that had developed in Germany in the decades after the war. And I should mention that when I'm talking about Germany, I'm really focusing on the Federal Republic. The case law that had evolved in East Germany was a little bit more complicated, a little different. It's possible that we would have a chance to talk about that during the question and answer if we're interested. But in focusing specifically on the Federal Republic, I think it's fair to say that, in many ways, I think for many historians, for many just observers today, we kind of think of Germany as almost the kind of the poster boy of the country that has really done a very impressive job of approaching this very difficult past in a responsible, open fashion. And yet, and in many ways, I agree with that. But I think if you look at the legal response to Nazi crimes within the Federal Republic, there the story is a little less happy. You really see kind of a story of decades of missteps, of kind of using the wrong doctrine, having all sorts of political obstacles to successful prosecution, and that in many ways, however belatedly, the Demjanjuk case did represent a very important breakthrough. And so I was very interested in trying to show how it is that the decision in Munich in 2011, how it broke with earlier German case law, and why it did so. That is, maybe if we can make sense of it, not just juridically, but also politically, that is why it is that this breakthrough happened at this point of time rather than perhaps decades earlier. So I think those were the kind of the general goals of what I was trying to do in the book. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about Demjanjuk, just to give maybe a little background to the audience who might not be as familiar, and then we can maybe start with the question and answers. So Demjanjuk was born in Ukraine in 1920. He was then drafted into the Soviet Red Army in 1941 after the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Then the following spring, in the spring of 1942, he was taken as a prisoner of war by the Wehrmacht, by the German army. And Demjanjuk's first line of defense, basically throughout all his kind of lengthy encounters with the law, was to insist that basically from the time that he was taken as a prisoner of war until the end of hostilities, he remained in a German POW camp. If we jump over the war period and just look at the post-war period, Demjanjuk ends up in 1945, after the end of hostilities, he ends up in a displaced person camp in Germany, not an unusual place to find oneself. He basically bounces around a number of DP camps until 1952, at which point he's able to immigrate to the United States. He becomes a naturalized U.S. citizen in 1958. On the same day that he becomes a naturalized U.S. citizen, he officially changes his name from Ivan to John. And then the next few decades, he goes about assembling what we could describe as kind of a nice middle-class life. He works as a machinist for Ford. He's a UAW worker. Remember, this is a time at which high-paying, unionized, blue-collar jobs really permitted a successful transition into the middle class. He lives in a ranch house in suburban Cleveland, in the suburb of Seven Hills, and he goes about raising a family. And his legal troubles begin in the mid-70s, and this is when American investigators first receive information that suggested that after having been taken prisoner of war by the Wehrmacht in 42, that he was then plucked out of his prisoner of war camp by the SS and then brought to a very different camp called Czerniki. And Czerniki was an SS training camp that basically trained largely Eastern Europeans, not exclusively so, but largely Eastern Europeans, to serve kind of auxiliary roles in Nazi genocide. And then the evidence suggested that after having trained at the Czerniki camp, well, this is where everything gets a little complicated, where originally the investigators came to believe that not only had he served as a death camp guard, but he served as this particularly notorious guard who had earned the sobriquet of Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible. That's when Demjanjuk, he faces by far the largest the most highly publicized denaturalization proceeding in American history. That results in him ultimately being denaturalized and extradited to Israel to stand trial. He's convicted in Israel. He's convicted in Israel almost exclusively based on the eyewitness testimony of survivors of Treblinka, who all swear with absolute certainty to recognize in Demjanjuk their former tormentor. He's convicted, he's sentenced to death. Had he been executed, he would have been only the second person executed in Israeli history. The only person ever executed in Israel was Adolf Eichmann after the Eichmann trial in 1961. His appellate phase, we're now in the early 90s, and his appellate phase fortuitously coincides with the unraveling of the Soviet Union. And what this means is that basically hundreds of thousands of pages of documents, which had been kind of moldering in KGB files, now Israeli defense attorneys and prosecutors get access to this material. The material now indicates that the real Ivan the Terrible was not Demjanjuk, it was this Ivan Marchenko, another Ukrainian. This evidence suggests that Marchenko was killed in fighting in the Balkans at the very end of the war. But it makes very clear that the Israelis are about to execute the wrong guy as Ivan the Terrible. And what also complicates the whole thing is the evidence isn't entirely exculpatory, because it does suggest that if Demjanjuk had never been this Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka, that he nevertheless had served as a guard at Sobibor. And then for very complicated reasons, well, not for complicated, the Israeli Supreme Court then voids his execution. There are complicated reasons why he's sent back to the United States, but he does return to the United States. Bizarrely, he has his citizenship briefly reinstated, stripped again, only person in American history ever to be twice stripped of his citizenship. And then ultimately he's deported to Germany. In Germany, he then is tried as having been a guard at Sobibor, and that kind of basically brings us to where we are today. So I think with that as a background, maybe we can open up to questions.